All right, it's 4 o'clock. I'm going to call the meeting to order. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. Any disclosures of pecuniary interest, committee? There being none, we will go to the consent items. I should indicate that 2.4, I asked for a motion, first of all, to move that after the in-camera session. If I could, Councillor Lewis, second by Councillor Lehman. I will just call the vote on that. After the in-camera.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Thank you. Now we'll go back to the rest of the consent items. Are there any items to be pulled? Councillor Lewis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd just like to pull 2.6 just to deal with that separately.
Thank you. Any other items to be pulled? There being none, then we will move items 2.1 to 2.3, item 2.5, and items 2.7 through to 2.13 to be moved on consent. Have a mover, Councillor Pelosa, seconder, Councillor Lehman. And while we're doing that, anyone have any comments on any of the consent items? Questions? Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to staff, just a couple questions. First of all, on item 2.7, in regards to the contracts for the tandem axle trucks and dump boxes, recognizing that about half the equipment we're looking at replacing at once, wondering if it would be better to stagger it over a couple of years, just because in 10 years we're going to have half that fleet again being up for replacement at the same time.
Through the chair, an item like that is always considered when we're looking at the end of life for these vehicles. In this case, they went through actually 2 different analyses. These ones, they've got to go. They're at the point where they're at end of life. They'll be pushed 1 further year before the new ones arrive, and it is just not possible to keep them on the road after that.
Thank you for that. And a question in regards to 2.3 and the environmental assessment for the proposed expansion of the W12A landfill. Appreciating that the landfill is in Ward 12, I appreciate all the work with staff that they do in public engagement and consultations, and the different liaison committees we're at, and the odor issues we discuss, and waste diversion, and everything, and all the hours we spend together. So thank you for that. And my question is, as we move forward with the plans, looking for the open houses mentioned on page 23, looking to make sure that one of those will be hosted in Ward 12, ideally at the South London Community Center, close to the residents who are most impacted by this. So looking for confirmation that one of the open houses could be held there.
Through the chair, yes, the place we typically pick is actually the Lambeth Community Center. That has been well received in the past and is central to all, and we're happy for other suggestions, but that has been an area where we're able to serve what we believe is the largest group of people with concerns.
Okay, we can follow up with each other afterwards then. I'm getting some feedback from residents, and we can discuss that outside of this. Also wondering, just for the public is aware, as I've been getting more questions about our waste diversion, the 60% green bins, where the city is with that, and as we're discussing the landfill expansion, if you just speak to that for a moment for anyone watching would be more aware of our plans for diversion as we go forward while we're talking about expansion.
Through the chair, to assist, we will be coming back to Civic Works Committee with a very large implementation plan in January of this year. That will include how we're going to get further engagement on the next steps of the green bin. There's still some unanswered questions. And of course, the matter is going to be in multi-year budget, and I'm sure there'll be some very good dialogue as well. So we will make sure that up-to-date information is available for all elected officials. Those reports, of course, go to the public. We'll be also working with our waste management working group as well and bringing them up to speed, probably in the month of December, to get ready for what will be quite a busy period of time. This particular report that's before you tonight is really one where we have just, because we've received approval on the terms of reference, we have to get out to the public as quickly as possible. So we can't time all reports at the same time. We would have liked to have done that, but this one was very important to get that announcement out because we're also in the London Free Press and I think the Londoner too with the notice of commencement for the next phase of work.
Anything further on the consent items? All right. We'll call that for vote then.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And item 2.6, Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, of course, colleagues, I pulled this. It's one of, I think, a lot of interest and discussion out in the community as to what we're going to do with automated speed enforcement and also known as photo radar, of course. One of the things that stood out for me in the staff report here, and I will say I'm fully supportive of us moving ahead with this contract award. The sooner that we can get these cameras out, personally, I feel the better. Enforcement is key in terms of our school zone, communities, safety zone, speed limit adherence. But I was a little surprised to see the report recommend a 3-month grace period when the program rolls out to give people a warning time to adapt to the fact that these are out there and that they would get warning notices rather than offense notices. I find 90 days to be a really long time to give people an opportunity to come to the realization that photo radar is out there. I mean, it's all in the media, and it's very simple. If you don't want a ticket, don't speed in school zones. It's not rocket science. So why the 90-day grace period being recommended, and what would the impact be of us directing that we shorten that?
Thank you. Through the chair, I'll start, and Mr. McGuire, that's been involved in the provincial committees, can elaborate further. But I guess the main goal of this program is to adjust behaviors as opposed to generate any revenue. And so we want to be very upfront with our education and awareness programs, and also, you know, being transparent with respect to signage on the street and letting Londoners know that you know, this automated speed enforcement tool is new, it's in place, and with the goal being that we have better speed limit compliance and better safety for vulnerable road users. So that's the primary goal, and we feel that you know, these advance notices will encourage a better buy-in to the program. But with that, I'll pass it on to Mr. McGuire.
Through the chair, I think Doug covered almost everything, other than to say this was discussed at the steering committee at great length, and the overall consensus was that municipalities were going to do a warning notice. It's new to Ontario, so there's a number of things from an administrative point of view of gearing up and staffing, particularly for Toronto, who will be processing all of the red light camera, they currently do red light cameras, all the automated speed enforcement infractions for the province. So they have a lot of staffing up to do. So the warning notices gets us sort of rolling on that without the all the significant deadlines with issuing the infractions as well. Also city staff in getting set and ready to sort of phase in this at administrative level.
Anything further, Councillor? Go ahead.
So That actually dovetails into a sort of a second question I had, but now I'm going to insert a part B to that first question. So is the issue then that Toronto, because we're using them to administer, they're not going to be ready to issue fines when we roll out? Or is this just a choice on our part? I'm just seeking some clarity here. If they're not going to be ready to start issuing fines on day one, then that gives me a little bit different feel to the 90 days than if we're just choosing to give people a warning. And I come back to, I would be comfortable with 1 month. I think that 3 months is being rather generous.
So through the chair, City of Toronto should be, and they plan to be ready for the enforcement for all of the municipalities. That said, there was a lot of assumptions, or there was assumptions made as we estimate how many infractions would be generated. So the first 3 months from a city staffing and provincial offences court to reconfirm whether our assumptions were correct and whether additional resources here are going to be required.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up on the Toronto piece with my next question then, and this, I promise, Mr. Chair, this will be my last question. I might have a little comment to share after we get an answer to this, but when we're doing the centralized administration, much like we do for red light cameras, are we still going to have an opportunity for people who receive an infraction notice under this program, similar to red light cameras, where there's going to be an opportunity for them to have a sort of a pre-court adjudication meeting where they can meet with somebody from city staff before they try and challenge it in court? Because I know that with the red light cameras, I mean, it's a pretty cut and dry, the photo evidence is right there, and we haven't had that many people challenge their infractions in court with the red light cameras. Will the process be similar for the automated speed enforcement?
Okay, through the chair, the automated speed enforcement is handled exactly just like the conventional enforcement. Once an infraction is issued, city administration, we cannot be involved in the process at all. They do have to go through provincial offences court. There isn't a process there for them to appeal and to speak to somebody about the infraction, but we are not, the engineering staff, we're not involved at all.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be clear that there was a sort of an appeal process before setting court dates and pursuing that road. So that helps me understand that there is in fact that opportunity. So colleagues, I'm just going to say that I'm frankly, we're not even a month into the new school year. And I don't mean any disrespect to the residents in the neighborhood, because I feel their frustration. I understand it completely. I live just a block away from a school zone myself. I see it every day. People speeding through these school zones. We're less than a month into the new school year, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't hear a resident, whether it be a parent or a homeowner in the area, complaining about the traffic behavior in the school zones. So I'm prepared to move this staff recommendation, but I am going to amend it to reduce the grace period to 1 month. I am making that motion now, yes.
All right, seconder, Councillor Pelosa.
I think we all agree on sympathies of speeders around schools. We're bringing in this red light camera, though. We're considering it for other areas of the city. So I just have some questions about implementation, because this is different than when we get a ticket from a police officer. It's going to arrive in the mail. So my first question is, how long would if I was caught by a camera, when would I receive that infraction notice?
There it goes. There, in the Provincial Offences Act, there are very strict guidelines for that. So the maximum would be 30 days. So if we cannot issue, or City of Toronto cannot have that mailed out within 30 days, it is not issued. Realistically, it is much shorter than that. You know, we're really looking at 1 to 2 weeks, very similar to the red light camera. It goes out in a couple weeks.
Is there any provision to send like a first offense for a license as a warning shot? Like this day, you would have received this ticket for this amount of money. We're waiving it for the first time offense, but on here I'd end be forewarned.
Through the chair, the issuing of warning notices was what was discussed just previously. But those notices would be sent out rather than the ticket. There is no means, once you get past that warning time, you know, that decided if it's 1 month or 3 months, the warning notices, the infractions are issued, and those are valid tickets that would be issued.
So during this the grace period, would people receive a notice in the mail?
Through the chair, yes, it would be a City of London letter advising them that they were recorded speeding and the location, but that would be the extent of it. There would be no dollar value associated with it. The other thing I think I should mention is, along with the infractions, unlike conventional enforcement, automated speed enforcement, the infractions are issued to the owner of the vehicle, like red light cameras, and there are no demerit points associated with automated speed enforcement.
So the situation could be is I could be lending my car to, you know, my son or daughter going to work every day, and they go through the school zone and they're going above the speed limit, and I receive in the mail 30 tickets. And at that time, I address it with, you know, my son or daughter and saying, hey, did you know you're doing this? But in the meantime, I've got a pretty hefty fine. So I can see the value of having some sort of grace period so that I do receive a notice before the bill starts adding up, so I can have that discussion with whomever is using my vehicle. So on that note, I understand Councillor Lewis's desire to get moving, and I agree. I'm just as concerned with the schools in my district, but I want a fair playing field. I want people to be totally, there's no excuse. If you have been warned, you've been driving over the speed limit, you know what's coming, as opposed to getting numerous tickets, which could add up financially to a pretty big burden, especially if you're not using the car. That's why I probably will stick with the recommended 90-day grace period.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to staff. Just looking at consultation, the page 54 I'm referring to, to consider installing signage and housing in all school zones in the city with a rotation of the cameras in respect to the ASE. Wondering how many cameras we're actually looking at getting or what it would take to actually have a school with, like, each school having their own. Like, I can't think of any schools, at least in my ward, that people aren't complaining with issues, and how we're gonna prioritize what students are safer and protected at some times versus others.
Through the chair, that was looked at as part of the evaluation process, as we're looking our semi-fixed locations or mobile, the preferred alternative. One thing I can say is the mobile, which we are recommending, is a much more fluid program that we can put those where there is specific problem, or, so there's more flexibility, and the costs are considerably lower than the fixed or the semi-fixed locations. I did do an estimate to install housing with 2 signs at half of the schools would be an additional $2.6 million. To do them at every school would be an additional $5.7 million. So there is a significant cost compared to using the mobile, and that's why we're suggesting we'll start with 2 units and rotate them around those areas with data-driven speeding issues in the school zones. And after the 1 year, we have that option in the contract to expand with additional mobile units.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a follow-up question in regards to the cameras. When we were in Quebec City, they had, heading into Quebec, they had their automated enforcement, and the camera, especially at night, when you drove by it, you saw it flashing as people were coming to town with excessive speeds. And you knew pretty instantly when the flash went off that something's happened and you're in trouble. I assumed the cameras were looking at the same, that a flash would go off and you'd know.
Through the chair, the flash on these units is an infrared, so a flash goes off depending on the ambient light, but it is not in the range that you would see the flash.
Could that be considered as part of the problem, as another counselor said, you know, you might not know until this ticket arrives up to 30 days later? Because however Quebec's doing it, like it must be connected to another white light, then and the light goes off and you know, like it is a flash. Is that being considered as well for people who would know and correct the behavior instantly in that area?
Through the chair, of the proposals that were submitted for automated speed enforcement, all flashes were infrared, so no, it's not an option with any of the proponents.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, I just want to share a comment to colleagues for their thought before we call this to question. I hear what Councillor Lehman is saying about wanting to have notice, and I'm sure that if he loaned his car to his son, he would expect his son to probably pay the bill at the end of the day too. But if you give a 90-day grace period, and the first time you have a violation under this program is on day 89, you're still going to be in the situation where the warning notice is not going to arrive until potentially you've gotten an infraction notice. So you're going to face that level playing field question no matter what you set the date at, whether it's 30 days or 90 days. Somebody making a violation on the last day of the warning system is still not going to get the notice that they committed a violation until the enforcement process is well underway. So we could extend it indefinitely. We could have a 365-day grace period. But at the end of the day, that's not going to change people's behaviors in a school zone. In my opinion, I think that we're going to continue to see, well, I got off with a warning, so I got lucky. And by the time I go by again, well, they're mobile cameras, so the camera won't be in that location again. I can get away with it. The halo effect that these things create is not indefinite. So when the halo effect, that benefit you get from having it in a zone for a while, and people say, okay, I better slow down because I know that there's a photo radar station here, disappears once they realize that station is gone. And it won't come back again until, frankly, they get the next ticket or see the box on the side of the road. So you're going to issue fines no matter what you do in terms of hoping to just change people's behavior with warnings. We've done public education campaigns. I've certainly handed out respect the limit signs to my constituents. I know that Mr. McGuire and I see Mr. Ridley is here, and they've both done lots of work around traffic calming issues in my ward, and safe and active walk to school routes, and letters have gone home from schools to parents about respecting school zone traffic rules. At the end of the day, the behavior isn't changing. So I'm hoping that colleagues will recognize that we do have to move on this. Let's not wait till we're into March break before we start enforcing this. Thank you.
Just very briefly from the chair, and I will be brief. With regard to Councillor Lewis's motion, I would not support his motion if this was a change in the law. In other words, if we were suddenly making speeding illegal, that would be one thing, but we're not changing the law at all. People are committing this offense every day if they drive too fast, so I'll agree with Councillor Lewis. I'm glad the numbers came out. I think it's really important that before everybody thinks, as they seem to all of a sudden, that all of a sudden we're going to have photo radar throughout the City of London. That's not what this is. This is a limited, very expensive program to deal with particular areas. So probably people have heard me say this a few times, that it's all about the enforcement. You can pass as many laws as you want. You can put up as many speed signs as you want. It doesn't mean anything unless you can enforce it. So I'm glad this is happening. So unless there's anything else, I'll call the vote. Motion.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Move on to item 3.1, which is a presentation from the Cycling Advisory Committee. Mr. Linton and Ms. Henderson are here. Please come forward. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you, through the chair and to the committee members. We are with the Cycling and Advisory Committee. I will be very brief. I would just like to note that this is a report on our first committee, even though it is the 8th one of the year. My only note here is that we just decided to create a subcommittee to review and discuss sport and cycling in the City of London. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair to the committee, thank you for the delegation. I've prepared a speech. It is 7 minutes, and I'm requesting 2 extra minutes, please.
Yeah, unless the committee has a difficulty with that, that's fine with me. But we will time it at 7 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Who's got a clock? Nobody.
Set up.
Where?
Sorry, is that showing? Oh, there it is. Okay. When I first moved to London in 2007, someone told me that London is among the nation's leading markets for new restaurant chains because our city is so thoroughly average. Big companies have tested credit cards, raw juice, and tea bags. And if you like Tim Hortons dark roast coffee, you have Londoners to thank. London ranks above the so-called microcosm cities because our city is so thoroughly average than any other place. We are spectacular in our ordinariness. When I started researching 12 years of reported motor vehicle bicyclist collision data in our city, it felt trustworthy. The numbers are incredibly big, and so we could say with statistical significance how motorist speed interacts with cyclist injury, and we could show the clarity, the impact of road violence on our family and our neighbors and our friends. I'd like to draw your attention to 2 graphs. One is probability and the other is proportion. For those seeing this for the first time, figure 1 shows probability of bicyclist injury versus motorist speed. The red and the green lines show the downward trends in both the none and the minimal injuries. Yet as motorist speed increases, the probability of minor and severe injuries increases. The blue line shows the probability of minor injury peaks around 40 kilometers per hour, but at 50, we see severe injuries sharply increase. And at 60 kilometers or more, 27% will have a catastrophic or a fatal injury. That's 1 in 4. If we keep our motor vehicle speeds under 40 kilometers, meaning 30, It can reduce the odds of having a severe injury from 19% to 13%. On the proportion chart, which is figure 2, you can see the non-injuries disappears at 40 kilometers per hour. Small changes can have big consequences for people. When a car hits a human at 40 kilometers per hour, every cyclist is injured. In our model, we wanted to know if other factors made a difference. Collision locations, such as an intersection or a non-intersection? No. Was it rush hour? No. Substance use, elderly, children, nighttime riding? No, no, no. Speed is the only factor. I made these graphs a few weeks ago to kind of demonstrate how we needed to reduce speed on our streets and keep vulnerable road users safe. And I felt like I was doing something meaningful, and I showed a friend. He's the kind of person who's smart without being showy about it. And he said, "It looks like every other graph." It was a totally unremarkable comment for an unremarkable graph. This same graph has been duplicated in cities around the world for the past 20 years. Everybody talks about reducing speeds, but no one wants to do anything about it. We believe that speed limits will get us where we need to be, only faster. But perhaps that's too pessimistic. In 2017, London, Ontario Municipal Council adopted Vision Zero, the main points being that no loss of life is acceptable, and traffic fatalities and serious injuries are preventable. Vision Zero does not recommend 40 kilometers per hour. Pedestrians and cyclists shouldn't interact with any vehicles at going 30 kilometers or more. World-class cities have made this change. Ottawa, Minneapolis, Edmonton, Vancouver, Seattle, Montreal will reduce their neighborhood speeds to 30 kilometers per hour and their arterial roads to 40. And we travel to these cities and we profess our love for the open street. The very environments that we admire require the same policies in our own city. This is about equity. 30 creates connected, family-friendly neighborhoods where our kids can play, where our grandparents and our friends with mobility needs can feel safe. This is economically advantageous. Complete streets are repeatedly proven to be good for business. 30 can be implemented cheaply and with minimal disruption. 30 reduces emissions. As councillors, you do have the responsibility of shaping our city's future. Speed limits are the single most powerful feature determining how fast our road users travel. And when I came to London, I had assumptions about our city, about what it is and what it could be. But I don't see an ordinary city. Londoners are welcoming. We took in 5% of all Syrian immigrants destined for Canada. That's an impressive number because our city makes up 1.4% of the total population. We have a fair electoral system. In 2018, we used ranked ballots in our local elections, a first in Canada. London is not average. London is extraordinary. We have elected leaders who are unafraid to make bold decisions. Please provide the resources to fully consider and refine workable options for road speed policies. 30 is best practice and it's best for everyone.
Thank you very much, Ms. Henderson. You had over a minute left, so do you want to use it? No, you're okay? All right. I would use it, but I'm a politician, so. Committee, any questions? No? Our guests, any questions? Councillor Turner.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me, and thank you, Ms. Henderson, for presenting to us. Just a couple quick questions. Your data here is very interesting to see a London context to it. Often we see the context of data in a bit more of a global sense. Could you tell us what the sample size is for, I guess this is about 10 or 11 years worth of data here?
Right, it's 12 years of data. It's from 2006 to 2017. There's 1,656 collisions.
So about 100 a year. roughly, or maybe 90 to 100 cyclist motor vehicle interactions. And the motorist speed was derived from estimates in like police reports and things like that?
In police report data, motorist speeds are given by the motorist.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody? Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. Very much appreciated, and come back anytime.
Thank you very much. I will.
We need a motion to receive and file. The Councillor Pelosa, seconded by a councillor. Councillor Lehman, anything further? We will call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Moving on then to our public participation meeting, item 3.2, which is the area speed limit program. I need a motion to open the public participation meeting. Councillor Pelosa and Councillor Lehman. Anything on that? We'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And I think there's a staff report, unless I think it would be helpful to the committee to have a brief report. Mr. McGuire?
Mr. Chair, we do have a brief presentation if the committee would like to hear.
Thank you very much. When you're ready, Mr. McGuire.
The item on tonight's agenda about area speed limits. New legislation recently approved allowed municipalities to lower the speed limit below the 50 km/h currently in defined areas. So the existing Highway Traffic Act, urban areas were 50 unless posted otherwise. In order to, say, lower it to 40, a municipality would need to do bylaws and install numerous signs throughout that area to be 40, whereas under the new program, it's area signs, so just the entrances into the city need to be signed. We looked at the collision history for the last 3 years. As I said, there's 161 involved vulnerable road users on minor residential streets and 86 in the major downtown roads. So that will come in as part of our proposal for the system. We're looking to improve safety in residential areas and where there's high volumes of vulnerable road users, and support the community by building more walking, cycling, make it more appealing and comfortable for people. In the report, you see these two heat maps showing on the left is the pedestrian collisions during that 3-year period, and on the right is the collisions with cyclists. I thought these are a little easier to see maybe on the paper report, but you can see there's a very definite concentration of collisions in the downtown area. Shouldn't be much of a surprise. That's where the highest number of pedestrians interaction with motor vehicles are. The same with cyclists, are spread out a little bit more, but again, concentrated mostly in the downtown. I'm not going to go through this list, but these are all the things that in engineering looks at when determining the appropriate rate of speed. Lots of things that are taken into consideration. That being said, drivers do tend to drive the speed that they feel is appropriate. artificially lowering a speed below what drivers perceive has very little impact on the actual speed of vehicles. Side friction, the presence of driveways, narrower roads, those all impact how a driver perceives and will drive. We're recommending a rate of speed of 40 kilometers an hour for residential roads and some of the minor downtown streets. Looking at this, it's those narrow residential streets, their intended use of the road, residential, high pedestrians in the downtown and cyclists. In the residential areas, the frequent driveways. And as I mentioned about the high volume of vulnerable road users. Lowering that speed limit at this time lower than what is perceived as appropriate, as I mentioned, will have very minimal impact on the actual operating speed. It will result in significant non-compliance, greater speed differentials, and an increased need for enforcement resources. One of the concerns with speed differential is drivers, cyclists, pedestrians perceiving the speed that vehicles are approaching them as being lower than what they actually are. So if I'm, wanting to cross the road and I think they're traveling at 30, I don't have as much time as if their actual speed is at 40. So we want to make sure that we don't have that same speed differential. Get Involved London survey was started in June and went through to the end of July. There was a astounding 5,645 responses to the survey. Good sampling of the city. The lowering the speed limit was the first question posed, and almost evenly split. 52% of those respondents supported lowering the speed limit. 48 were opposed. 2/3 of those that supported lowering it agreed to 40 kilometers per hour, and 1/3 a speed limit lower than 40. Interesting to note in the survey, 30% of the people that said don't lower the speed limit actually did respond to and choosing as 40 as the appropriate speed. So even though they did not agree, they did suggest 40 was appropriate. Also on that, the question had to do with community safety zones, and as you can see, the overwhelming support of the 5,000 plus respondents supported the implementation of community safety zones. For those that may not be familiar, community safety zones are designated by council for certain areas, and speeding fines are double in community safety zones compared to those without. So our proposed program, reduce the speed limit to 40 in the residential areas and in those major roads in the downtown, such as Wellington Street, Richmond, Queens Avenue, King. The 50 kilometer an hour current speed limit on York and Horton Street, those would remain. Implement community safety zones at the same time as we are implementing these area speed limits. Maintain the speed limit in school zones at 40 kilometers an hour, but look at the further reduction to 30 kilometers an hour as drivers are more, we get that driver behavior starting to change, and then look at reducing that. And point out it's a $1 million investment for safety to install the 2,000 sets of signs as described above. Any questions?
Any technical questions only at this point in time? Anybody? Councillor Turner, technical questions only, please.
Okay, thank you. McGuire. My apologies. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, if I might ask, you mentioned that in here that speed limit lower than what drivers perceive could result in significant non-compliance and generate different speeds. Also, that 40 kilometers is the appropriate. What's the source for that? Where does that come from? A lot of the data that we've seen shows significant benefits and reductions in injuries associated with 30 kilometers an hour. I haven't been able to find a source that says that there's actually an increased risk by going to 30 kilometers an hour versus 40. And this seems to imply that there's more of a risk because of a perception difference between a cyclist or a pedestrian versus the speed of the car.
Through Chair, the research behind this, I think what most people refer to is, you know, if you post it at 30, everybody's going to be traveling at 30. Well, that's not the case. Drivers will travel at a speed they feel is appropriate. So yes, quite right. Vehicles traveling at 30 kilometers an hour, the surviving those collisions for pedestrians and cyclists are much better. But we recognize from an engineering standpoint that those drivers will still continue to be traveling at 40 kilometers an hour or greater. Currently, we have 40 kilometer hour zones in the city at the school zones, and the average speed in those school zones can be up as high as 18 kilometers an hour above the speed limit, so 58 kilometers an hour, even though we've reduced them to 40. Automated speed enforcement will help that, but that's just the same sort of thing. You post it at 40 or you post it at 30, achieving that without enforcement and a change in driver behavior is not achievable. With time, I agree that drivers' behavior, like we see with red light camera, is improving. Then it would be the time to revisit and look at lowering that speed limit further.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you, and thank you, Mr. McGuire. So that sounds a little anecdotal. I think that's my challenge with this. What's the basis? Is there a body or a movement that's supporting the direction of 40 versus 30? Or is this something that we're developing internally? Is there a scientific basis to say 40 is the number that drivers don't behave appropriately at 30 kilometers an hour, and so we'll set it at 40? Because to me it sounds like if people already speed over top of the limit, then setting the limit lower means that the mean speed of those streets is going to be lower rather than 10 kilometers higher.
And I just point out, you're sort of pushing the edge on what would be a technical question. You're debating, you're on the edge. I'll allow this one, but not sort of going on.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chair.
No problem.
Specifically, I didn't get an answer to the question is, what's the basis for the recommendation?
The setting of speed limits and associated, design guidance is provided through various technical manuals produced by associations such as the Transportation Association of Canada, provincial manuals, manuals from the states, and the technical rationale behind those is what Mr. McGuire was explaining. So that is where the guidance comes from, and that it's long established, and we're also guided. With consideration from those manuals of what sort of the norms are within the province and driver expectation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, that deserves one follow-up. So then, compared to our peers across the province, where are they setting? We've heard from Ms. Henderson a number of municipalities that set their targets at 30 rather than 40. Other municipalities that have taken advantage of the change in the Highway Traffic Act changes, have they started to set theirs are there other cities that are going with 40 versus 30, or is there a consensus amongst our peers across the province?
Through Chair, I'm only aware of Ottawa was the first municipality to adopt this area speed limit. At the time, they had introduced 2 areas, and both of those were at 40 kilometers an hour. City of Toronto, Hamilton, and a few others have now also adopted it, a little bit ahead of London, all at 40 kilometers an hour. I'm not aware of any in Ontario that are adopting a 30 kilometer an hour speed zone in these areas. That said, there are some that have, for their school zones, 30 kilometers an hour, but not a 30, I'm not aware of any that are 30 kilometers an hour across the entire area.
Any other technical questions only? All right, we're going to open it up to public participation. So many of you have probably done this before. Each person will be allowed 5 minutes to speak, and we will time that. I'll give you a 30-second warning. Again, it's not a large group, so I'm hopeful that there won't be any booing, applauding, cheering, and that sort of thing. We like people to be able to speak without any feeling that they'll be made uncomfortable, and I know none of you will do that. So now I'll start down at the bottom. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken at the bottom who wishes to speak? No? We'll go. So you want another shot at it? I just would like to respond to the comments that were just made. All right, then we may respond to you, just so you understand that. Okay, go ahead.
The question was, are you aware of any other municipalities in Ontario with 30 kilometers? Yes, Toronto and East York Community Councillors voted unanimously to reduce the speeds on residential streets to 30. Hamilton has neighborhood projects. Different neighborhoods have voted for 30. Ottawa has voted in neighborhoods for 30. So there's many examples across Ontario specifically that have voted neighborhoods or for the entire neighborhoods for residential streets.
Thank you very much, and that'll give, I think, our staff an opportunity before the next meeting to correct any information if they were incorrect. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I hope staff heard that, and that it would be really good, I think, for council to have clarity on that particular issue, given what Ms. Henderson said. All right, we'll move up top then. Does anybody wish to speak?
Hi there. My name is Daniel Hall. I'm the Executive Director of London Cycle Link. I'd like to say a few words about this. So I had the privilege of attending the Ontario Bike Summit in April, and one of the keynote speakers was a Dutch mobility expert, and he came to speak to a room full of people who want to see more bikes. And when I asked him afterwards, I said, okay, in North America, mid-sized cities, what's one thing you could do? What's the first thing you will do to improve cycling, to make it more, to encourage more people to cycle? He said, reduce your speed limits to 30 kilometers an hour in neighborhoods. That was his first thing. And so I've held on to that, and it's one of our top priorities as London Cycle Link to see, because it really does change the game for encouraging people to share space. A lot of our neighborhood streets, we're not going to see protected bike lanes on them. It doesn't make sense in a lot of contexts. So when we reduce speed of heavy vehicles, suddenly it feels that's the right speed to bike alongside. It's the right speed to let our kids play outside in the front yard. There's lots of reasons why this is an important thing. We have a cycling master plan that wants 5% mode share of cycling trips. We're only at 1.7% right now. We need to do things. We need to be bold in getting there. This is one of those decisions that can be bold to help us get there. I want to talk about the survey a little bit. I think it was impressive that there was that many responses to this survey. But when we ask people, do you agree with 40 or below 40, I think it's really important to know who are we asking. And for the most part, people experience their neighborhood street through the windshield or behind the windshield of their car. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's 60 or 70 or 80% of people would be driving. And when you drive through a neighborhood street, you feel confident and in control at 50, especially at 40. It feels slow behind the wheel of a car. But if your vantage point is on the sidewalk or your vantage point is on a bike, suddenly that 40 or 50 feels really fast. And when you're walking your kid, when I'm pushing my son or my daughter in the stroller, it feels very different, that speed, when I'm beside traffic versus I am traffic. And so I'd like to just highlight that the vantage point, who are we asking? Let's make sure that we know that survey isn't just, we're not asking the vulnerable road users specifically, we're asking everybody. So I think this is an important point, that we have a chance to make something truly transformational in London here. This is a decision that can change the game to make our streets safer, to make it more enjoyable to use our front yards. It'll reduce noise in our neighborhoods. It'll reduce your inbox complaints about all the speeding you hear about. And I would like to also point out that, as Mr. McGuire mentioned and Mr. McCrae, that signage alone won't be the answer. That, I think they've said it repeatedly, that we can't just put up signs and sit back and watch everyone slow down. It's not going to happen. Photo radar will help, but we need to also supplement that with traffic calming. And I get that that's the really expensive part of this, but I think to have the goal be 30 is the really important part. To say we want traffic to be slow. Let's not worry about compliance or non-compliance. Let's set the right goal to say we want safe streets. This is in neighborhoods, right? This isn't our arterial roads. Let's have that be the goal and work toward it. And we know how to do it. We know how to design a road to get people to drive 30. We know how to do it. It's not difficult. It takes some rework, it takes some redesign, and possibly some more money. So let's use this opportunity in front of us. Let's make a bold decision to make our streets safer, to encourage cycling, to encourage walking. I think I'm excited to see what happens out of this, but I'd also like to say we can do this differently too. Like, we don't have to go all at once, say 30 kilometers an hour, whole city, boom. We could do pilot projects. We can do 30 kilometers on bike routes. There's lots of ways to sort of implement this and test and approve before we maybe make a sweeping citywide decision. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. Again, you were about a minute left, so appreciate it. Any other speakers? Yes, sir. Come to the down below, and then we'll go up top.
Oh, sorry.
Just your name, and that would be great.
Sure. Not a very good public speaker, but I'm
Don't worry
Cameron
about
Young. So I'm actually here against the changing proposal of 40 and 30, and Mr. Turner knows this as well. I just believe that the city has many issues already with traffic. We've got the train downtown. We've got the new King Street, which has gone from 3 lanes to now 1 when buses are stopped. The new BRT, certain areas are actually blocking traffic as opposed to getting off and diverting or having some sort of enclave that they can get out of our way. I believe the city needs to move faster and more efficiently, and I believe we've lost the chance of having a ring road that was done 20 years ago. We've got these new changes, which are, as I said, King Street. The traffic as it is right now is just not moving as efficiently as it should. And the vast majority of people are still driving, especially in winter. Obviously, bicycles are not on the roads as much. I drive for a living. I'm a paramedic, so I both see the people who get hurt in these accidents, but I also drive around these people. And I mean, this is anecdotal, but the people we do end up picking up on these calls, I hate to say it, but it ends up being not the pedestrian, but the cyclist's fault. And that seems to be one of the things we looked at. Our doctor over there explained that there's substance abuse, intersections. None of those changed things. The only thing that changed was speed. But I didn't hear anything, both in the presentation up there and her presentation as well, that the pedestrians or cyclists that will weave in and out of traffic, will have ones that don't know the laws of the road. They'll be on sidewalks when they should be on the road. Or they're not stopping for stop signs. They're not following traffic laws like drivers would. So I feel maybe education towards these cyclists might help. I know people who cycle for a living and a part of the association would know these rules, but there is a vast majority of the people that drive downtown and bike downtown that are actually causing major problems. And we're picking these people up. And I think it's maybe too much of the onus is put on these drivers when a lot of it could actually be put back on the people who are in the accident in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to this side. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Sandra Miller. I live at 32 Upper Avenue, and I am speaking on behalf of the Oxford Park Community Association where I live. Thank you for having this important and overdue discussion on reducing speed limits in London. Like all neighborhoods across our city, indeed our country, increasing levels of vehicle speeding and the associated rates of injury and death is a growing public health crisis. But we seem to shrug our shoulders as if the dangers associated with our car-centric lives are simply collateral damage, not something that can be avoided by thoughtful public policy and collective responsibility. In April, having a moment. In April 2018, London Free Press article noted that the city research states that about a third of drivers in neighborhoods speed over the limit. And the poll that was associated with that article asked, reduce driver speed in your neighborhood. And more than 90% responded often or sometimes. That was more than 1,500 respondents. So our local community association did a survey last year, and 55% of the respondents in our neighborhood of over 300 houses listed neighborhood speeding as their #1 concern. This confirmed a 2017 safety audit that we did, where participants also had numerous concerns regarding speeding. But despite these findings, traffic engineering staff have told us that according to their studies, our neighborhood does not have a speeding problem, and so therefore traffic calming measures are not being considered. So why is there such a disconnect? Perhaps because speed limits are already too high for residential neighborhoods, and our roads are designed to enable, indeed encourage, speeding even above and beyond those limits. According to our research, London currently has no design speed standards in its transportation design manual below 60 kilometers an hour. This means that traffic engineering staff are designing roads for 50 kilometers speed limit posting, but they know that people are going to drive 60 kilometers or even faster. And we don't even notice it as drivers because our brains tell us that the road is designed to go that fast and it's safe for us, when in fact we're driving at a dangerous speed for a neighborhood road. So our neighborhood, Oxford Park, is going to be undergoing a long-anticipated infrastructure renewal, including new water mains, new sewers, and new roads. So we're excited about this opportunity. It's long overdue if you've been through our neighborhood. Pothole City. So we're really excited about addressing the root problem of speeding, which is outdated, dangerous, and car-centric street design. We've offered to collaborate with engineering staff and consultants on designing our new streets using progressive, safe street design as championed by organizations like the National Association of City Transportation Officials, the Center for Active Transportation, and Love 30 Canada. If you don't know any of those organizations, I strongly encourage you to look them up. We've offered to serve as a pilot model neighborhood for progressive street design best practices. Unfortunately, those offers and requests have been declined. We've also asked city staff to make a general presentation to residents on safe street design, but that has also been declined. So we're now going to be working with Professor Jason Gilliland at Western University, who is going to come and speak to our association and talk to our neighbors and help educate us on what we can and should ask for when we see the city's proposed street designs later this fall. So Oxford Park Community Association strongly supports reduced speed limits in residential and school areas throughout the city. We urge the committee to adopt 30-kilometer-an-hour limits with enforcement using photo radar and police. 30 kilometers an hour, as other people here this evening have said, is an acknowledged safe street standard in many progressive jurisdictions around the world. In conjunction, and arguably even more importantly, we urge councillors to work with staff to ensure that all relevant road design standards and policies are updated as quickly as possible to reflect safe street design best practices. These updates can begin to make effective changes on road reconstruction projects in existing residential neighborhoods and in all new subdivisions. The conventional 3 E's approach of engineering, education, and enforcement doesn't provide the guidance we need to design 21st century transportation. We must look beyond traditional professional disciplines across conventional boundaries to make our streets safe for everyone. The new E's of ethics, equity, and empathy should guide every urban designer, engineer, planner.
We just hit 5 minutes, so if you could
and
wrap
I'm on my
up.
last sentence.
Wouldn't have interrupted you if I knew that, sorry.
Thank you. And our citizen involved in shaping our city. We must embrace these values if we are to change the status quo and create a transportation system that is safe, efficient, equitable, and sustainable. We can't justify designing for speed and increased vehicle capacity on one hand, while promising to deliver Vision Zero with the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other speakers? I know up at the top.
Grant Hopcroft. I don't have any particular affiliation right now. This particular issue came to my attention this morning while I was listening to the radio about a 2-hour drive from here. I finally had a chance to download the report about 3:45, so I haven't had a lot of time to prepare my statement here tonight. But I would like to urge the committee and staff to reconsider, in particular, part 1 of the recommendation, and that is applying the 40-kilometer default speed limit on local and collector streets in residential areas throughout the city. I think I'm prepared to agree, and I think most people are, that 40 is an appropriate speed limit in some places, and in other cases, much lower, depending on the number of driveways, the amount of conflicts in terms of other traffic in the area, and so on. But as I read it, this would apply to areas without driveways, as well as those with driveways. And I'll harken back to Mr. McGuire's comment earlier, which I've heard in this chamber and other rooms in this building many times. There needs to be acceptance of whatever rules come in. There needs to be a public consensus before people will willingly comply with whatever bylaws this committee and council see fit to pass. And so applying a one-size-fits-all approach, I don't think is the appropriate way to approach this, and I don't think it's a way that most Londoners would accept as an appropriate way of dealing with it. There's a lot of streets where the existing speed limit, it ain't broke, so why fix it? Fix those where speeding is a problem and where the speed limit is a problem. And I would differentiate between the two. I presume, passed on the consent agenda earlier tonight, an issue dealing with the speed limit enforcement issue. And in my experience, many people complaining about speeding in their neighborhoods aren't complaining about the speed limit, they're complaining about the people that consistently exceed the speed limit on those streets. I don't belittle the fact that in some cases the speed limit is as well too high, but it is the enforcement issue, which has always been an issue. And the photo radar, am I allowed to use those words here, is a solution in terms of those that don't see fit to comply for other reasons. But personally, I think it would be a huge mistake to take a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all approach to the streets around this city, and that this should be done on a street-by-street basis. And that's hard work. But do we want compliance, and do we want to address the real problems, or do we want to create a regulatory environment where most Londoners don't see fit to comply because they see so many cases where the regulations are excessive? And we've seen time and time again, when they get that sense, they're more likely not to comply, not just in those areas where they're not warranted in their view, but also in those areas that they may be unfamiliar with where it is warranted. So if we want to promote people's compliance on a voluntary basis, I think the street-by-street approach and the classification of those streets is the right way to go. Now, there's a lot of data in this report, and I'd just like to ask a few questions in terms of that data. First of all,
what we'll do is you can ask the questions, and then when the staff will reply to them. Yes.
And hopefully I'll be able to stay long enough to hear them, but it's more important the committee hear them. First of all, there's been a lot of data in here about collision statistics. There's nothing about injuries or the severity of those injuries, and tying that to the speed involved in the collision or the speed limit on that street. I really don't find the collision data that helpful in terms of understanding what it is we're trying to fix. The second issue is I don't see any reference in the report, and I'm assuming because there is no reference, there hasn't been any consultation with emergency services. I, like at least one other person in this room, have some experience in the provision of emergency services, and we all know that reduced speed limits reduce ambulance response times. And was the EMS consulted about this, and what is the impact on response times in our community? The second question I have, I don't see any reference to the LTC. And we know they're moving into an environment where they're trying to have better compliance with route schedules and on-time performance. And I see nothing in here that's going to help them maintain what they have? What is the cost to that? And what is the impact on the routes that would be affected by the regulations that are proposed here? So, Mr. Chair, I won't use up my full time. I know that's probably going to surprise you, but I would urge the committee to seek the answers to those questions and to take a considered approach to this, and in my view, also a bold approach in terms of addressing this where it's needed to be addressed rather than applying something across the city where it may not be needed.
Thank you very much, and we'll get answers to your questions when staff responds. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis Patricio. I'm the board chair of London Cycle Link. I didn't prepare what I'm going to say, but I'm not going to use my 5 minutes. I'm not a politician, so I'll be pretty short. It's just some remarks. So I heard two presentations, one from Mrs. Henderson, and she had social, economic, and health arguments to support the 30 kilometers limit. And I heard another presentation, and the main argument that I heard is that because drivers won't obey this limit, and this will be dangerous. And I heard some concern as well on the sense that we need to make sure that whatever regulations we will have people respecting those regulations. And I think this is a inverse logic. If we don't have respect, we shouldn't keep the speed limits high. If we know that this is the safest approach, we should make sure, and we heard some suggestions from Daniel Hall, that those people, they will be voluntarily following the limits, because this is the way that our roads are designed. And interestingly, we didn't hear an argument about the efficiency or the health benefits if you keep our limits at 40 or 50 kilometers, because the people who understand what transportation and road design is, they know that this is not the case. So addressing the concerns of about efficiency and health, the car in any city, it's the most inefficient mode of transportation. So if we create a city where we promote and encourage cycling and walking and transit, we will have a more efficient transportation system, and we will have less injuries and fatalities. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Any further speakers on this issue? Oh, yes, sorry. I thought you were I didn't know you were, I asked downstairs, but come on up. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Craig Linton. I just want to be clear, I'm speaking as a public citizen, not as chair of Cycling Advisory Committee. I would generally support the reduction of speed limits as proposed by staff, or even to the 30 as well. You know, a couple of the points that the people who oppose this actually kind of make the case, you know, for people who are, you know, wanting to try cycling and they're riding on the sidewalk. They will feel safer if they're riding on a street where the speed limit is posted lower and traffic speed is going lower. So they feel more safe, so they're going to be off the sidewalk and where they should be onto the road. So there was a couple of points there that I took out of there that were actually reasons to lower the speed limit, not keep them where they're at. And as a motorist, if we want to keep this city moving, I drive a lot. I drive a lot more than I cycle, or that I'm a pedestrian. As a motorist, if we want to keep this city moving, the best thing for that is to get more people on bikes and on transit, because the fewer cars that are on the road to begin with, the better that traffic is going to flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry I missed you when I went through the downstairs. Anybody else wish to speak? Yes.
Good afternoon. Mohammed Musa, 155 Thornton Ave. Lots of ground to cover here, but I will only address a few points here. Sorry, I did miss the presentation and I did get in here late, but glad to be able to make it in time. Just wanted to start out with, and I might be the outlier here, just wanted to start out with mentioning that there is a very overarching issue here that has not been addressed with the reduction in the speed limit. April 23rd, 2019, this council adopted a climate emergency bylaw or motion, not sure what it's referred to, where you ask for tangible ways of battling greenhouse gases and our carbon footprint. In this speed limit, if you reduce from 50 to 30, you are increasing greenhouse gases. It's settled in uncontroverted science, Virginia Tech, European studies. If you'd like the references, the citations for those studies, considerably. I understand where you're coming from with trying to do this, but reducing the speed limit is not going to slow people down from speeding. It's really not the way to, enforcement is the only way. And I understand you need community safety zones in order to put the automated, excuse me, automated speed enforcement stuff in place. But if you keep it at 50 and say, we're gonna ticket everybody who does 52, someone like me is gonna drive 45. The person who is going to get that ticket is not going to, is going to get it regardless whether it's 30 or 50. There is, as the gentleman who's not here right now said, that the report didn't show much about the severity of injuries, and I don't want to put a price or anything on safety. Safety is very important, but we really need the hard statistics for this. You know, it's a solution looking for a problem. I've said that before on other issues. In this case, we haven't even addressed it. Increase enforcement, absolutely. And with respect to the ASCs, it's putting the, I mean, I'm assuming you guys passed the consent items from earlier today with the contract award. It's putting the cart ahead of the horse. I mean, it's putting the cart ahead of an unborn horse, being that the regulations in Ontario have not even been updated to allow for that yet. Pilot project in Toronto, if I'm assuming correctly, possibly other places. And we do know what PC provincial governments like to do with what's come before them. One other thing I didn't see in here is when all the BRT discussion was going on, there was a value of time saved that was addressed in those. In this case here, there is nothing that shows a value of time lost. I know it might be grasping at straws, possibly, but this will reduce people's time. A bylaw will not remove us from a car-centric culture. If that's the intention of the bylaw, it's not going to work. People are still going to need to use their vehicles. But the main salient point I wanted to bring across here is we're actually doing less for the environment by reducing the speed limit in this zone, in this 30 to 80. Ideally for a gas engine, it is the ideal for the least fuel consumption is between 60 and 80. I'm not saying increase the limits to 60, but we have not even looked at this issue here. And I don't think this is going to push people to walk more or bike more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wishes to address the committee? Going once, going twice, we're done. Just going to have a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Lehman. Anything further? I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And before we go on, I just want to thank all the members of the public who participated. Your comments were very concise, on point, and extremely courteous. And believe me, that's very much appreciated. And I want to thank you for that. And I'm sure the committee does also. So I know there were some questions that were asked, and perhaps staff can answer them. I also want to give you a chance to answer the point of you not attending a couple of sessions, whether you have knowledge of that or whether you can provide some assistance with that. So, and then Mr. Hopcroft, I think, had 2 questions. One of the speakers said that staff had declined to meet with the community association. I just wonder if you can help that. Maybe we can arrange for that to happen.
Yes, certainly, through the chair. We have projects planned in the Oxford Park neighborhood. We attended a barbecue in July and shared our plans with the neighborhood, and certainly plan more discussions there. We are happy to remind council that regarding our design standards, we have deviated from the traditional methods that put the speed limits higher than where we wanted the speeds, and got in line with the new vision with our complete streets design manual, and it identifies for the type of street and the context of the street what the appropriate design speed is, and it lowers them than what is in the typical design guidance. So the information shared with the Oxford Park neighborhood at the recent barbecue and other presentations was at a higher level because we were just not into the design of the projects yet. But you know, as we get into it, we're certainly going to engage further, and we've had a good long-standing relationship with Oxford Park, and look to continue that. With respect to other questions, ones that I've kept track of, and you can tell me if I miss any, but there was questions about collisions versus injuries. The 161 collisions recorded in a 3-year period on the neighborhood streets, and then there's a higher number, I don't have it in front of me, that includes the downtown areas, 230, I believe. Those are all injury collisions. They're all with vulnerable road users, so it doesn't include minor fender benders with vehicles, but they're all injuries with pedestrians and or cyclists, and they're all injuries, and that's our London road safety strategy specifically targets those kind of collisions, and that's what our annual targets are based on, which I will remind committee, now that I have the opportunity, we are exceeding our targets. We had a 5-year plan to reduce with a goal of 10% reduction, and the last time I checked, we're down 30%. So we're really seeing good success, and it's something I'm proud of. The consultation on this topic was broad with the public survey, and it also included some specific groups. The Transportation Advisory Committee, the Community Safety and Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. It also included the London Middlesex Road Safety Committee, which is a variety of stakeholders that include London Police, and we've also had separate discussions with London Police on this topic, and it includes the Middlesex London Health Unit, the hospital, the schools. So that's the group that we developed the London Middlesex or the London Road Safety Strategy. So we got pretty broad feedback. We also reached out to London Transit Commission, and they're still working on their feedback to us. So I think it's been slightly delayed on their end, and but we're in ongoing discussions with them. So that is all the questions that
I believe that was, yeah, unless I'm missing something. Okay. All right, thank you very much. Committee, I'll turn it over to you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, if I could pose a question to staff, and I see this comes out of the public input, but also in the staff report, because I note that recommendation 2A, C, and E include parts of roads in the downtown area that are planned as rapid transit corridors. And I would like to know, if we lower the speed limit to 40, are we planning on exempting the rapid transit service from that requirement? And if not, have we built 40 kilometers into the rapid transit business cases for the time savings and the ridership and everything else that has been built around the rapid transit case? Or was that rapid transit case built around the existing speed limits?
Through the chair, I think it's important to recognize the difference between the posted speed and the operating speed for a transit service. On most of these routes, the bus itself would rarely get up to 50 kilometers an hour because they do have to stop. These are fairly lengthy buses, they're electric likely, so the likelihood that they would have been running at 50 for very long spaces in time. Bus rapid transit, I think, implies that buses are going quickly, but what it really should be is bus reliable transit. We don't believe there's a significant impact here. We're always reviewing and taking care of those model adjustments as the design proceeds, but the intent is that transit can operate effectively on these routes.
Anything further? No? Any other questions or comments before I go to non-committee members? And I'll go to non-committee members. Any comments or questions? Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess it's no mystery that I'm very interested and passionate about this one. There were some questions, and it's going to be interesting kind of pitting paramedic against paramedic here. Welcome, Mr. Young. Good to see you. The one question that came from Mr. Hopcroft was, but is this going to impact ambulance response times? No. On a lights and sirens emergency, emergency vehicles are exempt from the Highway Traffic Act and are able to move at the speed that they need to. In fact, actually, traffic calming measures such as speed cushions are more impactful in reducing the ability for an emergency vehicle to arrive on scene in a fast time because the emergency vehicle has to slow down for it in order to traverse it, especially when you have a patient on board. It's incredibly uncomfortable when you've got an injured patient trying to go over a speed cushion. That was something that was a big challenge of mine. That said, I did manage to convert a close to lethal cardiac rhythm by hitting one of the potholes or speed bumps, and it just happened to give enough energy to convert them back into a normal heart rhythm. So there are some benefits, but Mr. Musa brought up the point about emissions with vehicles and how they change based on speed, and he's absolutely right. At low speeds, that's to say 10 kilometers an hour, the emissions are at their highest. But then they drop fairly quickly. So at 30 kilometers an hour, at 10 kilometers an hour, it's 325 grams per kilometer. At 20 kilometers an hour, it goes to 210, so it drops it. At 30 kilometers an hour, it goes to 175. Then at 40, it goes to 165, and then 50, 160, which is its lowest point, and then kind of curves at the bottom there. So really tightly between 30 kilometers an hour and about 80 to 90 kilometers an hour, the emissions are generally the same. It's that first from 10 kilometers an hour to 20 kilometers an hour, and then from about 140 kilometers an hour over that you start to see significant emissions. And so that's from the EPA in the U.S. So that's helpful too, but I think it's a fair point, and if we're going to talk about our climate emergency, let's consider what that impact is, and let's talk about it. Let's get that out of the way. So through this, when this came forward, I did a lot of research. I took a look at PubMed and did lit searches to see what research there was out there, what the differences were. In the earlier report that came forward to council, there was a fatality curve that showed the impacts of speed on risk of fatal injury to pedestrians relative to vehicle speeds. So at 30 kilometers an hour, that risk was 10%. At 40 kilometers an hour, that risk was 27%. At 50 kilometers an hour, that risk was 70%. So that's a fairly marked difference, and one of the rationale for why we're looking towards reductions in speed limits. It didn't talk about injuries, though, and so I went searching a bit further to say what's the reduction on injuries. As Mr. McRae had mentioned there, that the data is about 161 vulnerable road user collisions in residential neighborhoods. That's about one a week. Over the 3-year period of time. So that's a high number. And then there's a study in Bristol, England, which applied 30 kilometer limits citywide. And they did it in a stepped implementation. And they actually showed that over time that they were able to pretty quickly see a reduction in injuries, roughly equivalent to what they saw in fatalities. The reduction in fatalities ended up being about 67%. Compared to where it was before, and they saw a corresponding reduction in injuries too by going to 30. I think we also have to take a look at what are, Mr. McGuire had talked a little bit about the implementation challenges of going from a higher speed limit area to a lower speed limit area, and that those speed limits wouldn't necessarily be respected. So one of the challenges we see, and I think it was mentioned in one of the presentations, as you're traveling along a 60-kilometer-an-hour road, and I think Mr. McGuire had actually said it, when you're traveling along a 60-kilometer-an-hour road, and then it changes to 50 kilometers an hour, just because of the posting, how much behavioral change do we see in the difference? Very little. People will continue to travel at the speed that they're comfortable at. Unless there's a marked difference in that speed. So thinking about coming over the hill in a country road and suddenly you're in a town, you know that somebody's going to be hiding behind a tree with a speed gun ready for you when you come into that 60 zone from the 90 zone you were just in. And that's an encouragement to really bring your speed down. The same reason why I think it's important that we see a larger differential between the arterial road speeds and the residential road speeds is because it is marked difference. And so it forces a change in behavior. But it also, in terms of some of those negative impacts that we see and the complaints that we hear as counselors all the time, number one complaint that I receive is the perception of road speed, is that cut-through traffic gets reduced because if it's seen that the speed that you can travel on collateral roads is the same or close to the speed that you can travel on an arterial road, why stay on the arterial road? I can go through the neighborhoods instead. So there's a really strong argument to be made for that difference. Mr. McGuire talked a little bit about that challenge in people respecting the limit. Yeah. So if people are traveling 18 kilometers an hour on average over the speed limit and you make it 40, then the average speed is 58. If it's 50, it's 68. If it's 30, it's 48. It's getting a lot closer to where we want it to be. And that's without any enforcement activity to it. We've reduced the average speed traveling on that road by an extra 10 kilometers an hour. The objectives of Vision Zero are to get us to 0 injuries and fatalities, not 50% as many. So I'm not quite sure where the argument for 40 comes from. I don't see a lot of evidence for it. In Boston, they did a reduction in speed limits, and we talked about how well people will respect the speed limit reductions. And they did a 10-kilometer or a 10-mile-per-hour reduction, and they actually showed that the compliance, or sorry, I guess the events where somebody would have higher than this posted limit, so by 10 miles an hour, 20 miles per hour, 30 miles per hour, or maybe it was kilometers an hour, they showed that there was substantial reduction in those traveling about 15 kilometers an hour over the posted limit. There was a fair amount of compliance or reduction in those traveling 10 kilometers an hour. There was a little bit of reduction in those traveling 5 kilometers an hour. And then those obeying the speed limit, there wasn't a huge difference, which is what we would expect to see. So I think this is the challenge for me, is to say our objective is to reduce or to eliminate. The vision is 0. Why are we recommending a measure that doesn't get us there? If we want to take a look at the total impact to people, I took a look at the city's map and tried to find anything that was more than an average of 4 blocks. I would imagine the way our city is designed is in such a way that on average, it would be about a 4-block trip to get yourself to an arterial road. There's not many places where you get much deeper into it. So the time that you'd be traveling on a speed-reduced road would be 4 blocks. The total impact to your commute time, very negligible. But the total impact to the sense of safety in your community is rather profound. The speed that people travel on the road impacts the way we interact with the road, whether we let our kids learn to ride their bikes on the sidewalk or on the road, whether we play in the front yards versus the backyards, whether we take walks along those roads or whether we choose other roads. The way we interact with our neighborhood is markedly impacted by the travel speed. When I go to neighborhoods in other cities that have posted 30s, I feel incredibly comfortable versus when I'm walking on a street that has a posted 50. maybe we're splitting hairs on the 30 and 40 part, but all the evidence shows that 30 kilometers an hour is markedly safer than 40 kilometers an hour, has minimal impact in the difference of travel times, and is really the most common sense place. So I would really encourage the committee, if they could, if I were on the committee, I'd make a motion to say adopt 30. That's your prerogative. I certainly make the argument at council should it not come forward here. But I think those are really important points, and I did want to bring them here to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lewis?
Thank you, Chair. First, through you, a question to staff, and we come back to the recommendations in the report. For the sake of everyone, can you, when we're talking about the 40 on all residential neighborhood streets and collectors, how do we, as a municipality, how do we, in terms of the provincial guidelines, differentiate between a neighborhood street and a neighborhood collector?
The classifications are laid out in the official plan, and that's the guidance we would follow. But as far as the road user, it would be, you know, each of these areas would be signed, and that's what drives the need for all the signage is any given community, all of the entrances off the arterial road would have that area speed limit sign that notifies the motorists that they're entering an area of the 40-kilometer area speed limit.
I recognize that, and I know that I've asked this question before with regard to snow removal, but I want members of the public to understand in terms of how we as a city define what is a collector versus what is a neighborhood street. From the public's point of view, what would the difference be?
From the public perception, the types of streets that we're talking about applying the area speed limits to are those types of streets that are predominantly residential, predominantly you know, fronted with, you know, frequent driveways, the types of streets that most Londoners live on, and with the exception of that, we're also including some downtown streets where we recognize there's a high number of pedestrians and cyclists, and so the protection for vulnerable road users should also apply in that area.
Okay, thank you for helping get that publicly out so that folks who may be watching at home or may want to review this later can understand the difference in those. Colleagues, when I look at what we have before us here in the staff report, and I will say, and I heard a member of the public say, you know, if the speed limit is under 40, well, kids can play outside safely in the front yard. Well, let me tell you, I'm over 40, and I played in the front yard just fine with speed limits as they were in the past. I don't think that that's actually an argument that carries a lot of weight. And I do certainly agree that in terms of getting the cart ahead of the horse a little bit, we just updated traffic calming policies for this community 3 months ago or thereabouts. We just earlier in this committee meeting approved the tender for automated speed enforcement. So those are steps that we are taking already to address this problem, that one of which hasn't even come online yet. The earlier one, the traffic calming policy update, I know certainly that Mr. McRae and his team have been working hard to roll out as much traffic calming as neighborhoods have requested within our budget as we're able to do. I'm thankful for the fact that we got some traffic calming around a couple of the schools in my ward this summer. But these things are just things that are coming online now. And we do have to look at proportionality here. We do have to look at compliance. For me, 30 is absolutely a non-starter at this point. I can wrap my head around 40. I think that 40 is quite reasonable. And I'll tell you, I've done the experiment physically of driving 30 in my neighborhoods and then driving 40 and then driving 50. And at 30, you know, the perception is going to be by drivers all across the city, you might as well get out and push. We can talk about the fact that the goal is zero, ever, to have zero fatalities, zero injuries ever. Well, we could encourage that by asking people to never leave their homes and not own a car. Don't go outside because it's dangerous. Something could happen. Unfortunately, accidents are a reality of life. Now, should we take reasonable steps to reduce those anywhere we can? Yes. Is that number ever going to be zero? In reality, no, because human error happens. Accidents happen. I've had pedestrians walk in front of me when I had the right of way with their faces in their cell phones. And I'm sure that others have experienced the same thing. I know that I've also had aggressive drivers when I've been on my bike cut me off because they were trying to make a right turn and being very aggressive about it when they're at a red and trying to make a right turn on a red. So I see both sides of the coin. I really do. To me, 40 is an area where I think we strike a balance. We recognize some proportionality here. That 50 on a neighborhood street, I would say, is a little too fast. I think that 40 is not not an unreasonable number to expect people to travel at. So my biggest concern in the staff report is the arterial roads that we're referencing in the downtown core. And King and Queen, where we're creating protected bike lanes. We're moving with the east-west bike corridor, which we actually had the consultation design earlier in this committee's report. We've gone to the extent of putting a temporary bike lane on King while construction has happened. We hope to move those cyclists back onto Dundas when Dundas Place is completed, and we're moving in that direction. But King and Queen are, to me, arterial roads, and we can talk about accident statistics, but the fact is, where there's density, there are going to be more accidents. A pedestrian or a cyclist or another motor vehicle, you can't hit something when it's not there. So human error doesn't occur when there's when that collision can't happen because there's nothing to collide with. And I don't say that to decrease the importance of trying to be as safe as we can. But I would be prepared to move the staff recommendation, striking parts in part 2, A, C, and E, which are the King, Queen, Wellington areas. And I recognize that Wellington between Horton and Pall Mall, that's not an entire transit corridor route. Once we get up into Pall Mall, things quiet down quite a bit naturally. But from Horton, certainly up to Queen it is. And that's a primary corridor in and out of our downtown. And I'm not comfortable changing the speed there. But I would be prepared to accept the rest of the report as it's written. I think staff should be thanked for putting all the time and effort they have into this. And I think that this is only one part of the solution ultimately, and I've already referenced the fact that we've updated traffic calming policies. We're bringing in photo radar. I think we are taking appropriate steps to address safety in the community. So I will put that motion forward and see if I have a seconder for that.
Is it easier to just put forward the amendment so we don't defeat the entire motion as amended?
You're at committee, so you can put forward the whole motion.
Okay, why don't you, so you're bringing that motion. Is someone prepared to second that motion? You don't have a seconder, so that one will fail. Anything further, councillors? Councillor Lamb.
Okay, I want to weigh in with my thoughts on this. I think we're talking about one thing, which is speed. And I think we're trying to solve the problem of speed in our neighborhoods to address safety, which Vision Zero speaks to. The disagreement, I think, falls on how do we affect speed. Half the residents, roughly half, think that the current speed limits are fine in the survey, but where there is a big support, I think in areas of addressing speed through other means and the community safety zones, primarily schools, with the idea of doubling fines, go to enforcement, cameras go to enforcement. Does changing this, the number on a sign in the street change the speed? Mr. McGuire's mentioned that we did that with school zones, and, you know, we still see people traveling on average faster than the posted zone. And we have no bigger example of people driving at the speed they feel comfortable than on the 401. I mean, if you ever tried to drive the speed limit on the 401, you'd probably get a ticket. I think where we should invest our money and time is on enforcement. I think it's a false safety that makes us maybe feel better if we have lower posted signs in various parts of the city. I think it adds to confusion when you are traveling on one spot in the city and then it turns into a different speed limit. I understand we do have a few of those right now, but the more you add to that, adds to more of the confusion. And when you have confusion, it's not just from drivers driving, but it's confusion on expectations. People in their neighborhoods or on certain streets have an expectation of speed. If the speed posted is not what speed people are traveling on, then it becomes more of a dangerous thing. So if you post a speed limit of 30 and no one's obeying that, you're gonna find trouble. If you change it to 40 and no one's obeying that, same thing. I think we should focus on enforcing the speed limits that we currently have. The survey shows, I think, similar thinking, and from what I've heard from constituents as well. I hear about concerns about speed in school zones and cut-throughs, but what I've heard numerous times is that they don't see changing the speed limit as addressing those concerns. So I will not support a motion that involves changing the current speed limits. I fully support our efforts in enforcement, and I think the our camera program in the school zones are a step for sure in that direction. Thank you.
Just a couple of comments. I'm glad we're looking at reducing the speed in residential areas. In my experience, talking to residents, most people really would like the speed limit reduced in their neighborhood, and they're not so keen on reducing it elsewhere. They'd really like it to be lower where they are all the time and where they're living. And I think that gets to the issue that we're trying to deal with, which is I think there's actually a lot of support for vehicles moving more slowly on the streets. And people, I think they balk at the idea of themselves when they're driving, going a bit slower. And I want to distinguish between what the speed limit is and what the actual speed on the street is. Because we know, for example, at 4:30 p.m. on Oxford Street, you're not driving the speed limit, right? It's too congested for that, and people are going to be going slower. And I think that's when the majority of people are moving around. That's why we have so much congestion at those times. And really where you get the big gaps between the speed limit and what the average speed is when there's not a lot of vehicles on the road, and people could be driving 50 on Oxford Street or 60 on Oxford Street, and they do. And sometimes they go much faster than that, much faster. Because there's no vehicles on the road and it's a huge wide open roadway, and they go very quickly. And you can get some very serious accidents in those circumstances. So I like the approach of lowering the speed limit on, like it's around about 60% of the roads, right? The collectors and the local streets, and not the arterials. I think that's where we have a lot of the short trips. This is where people really, there's a lot of demand to lower the speed limits. So generally I support that approach. I also think we need to look at, in the school zones and the community safety zones, that's where we should have it even lower than what the overall residential setup is now. So right now we've got 50 pretty much everywhere, and then 40 in some of these school zones and community safety zones. Once there's automated enforcement for those areas, I think compliance is going to be very high. I think the next step is probably to have 40 in the residential areas and 30 in the community safety zones and school zones, which is only about 1% of the roadways, right? But it's where about 95% of the kids are all day. And I think we can probably move towards that as as an alternative. I know our staff are proposing 40 kilometers and starting at 40 in the community safety zones and the school zones. My preference would be to go to 30. I do think it's a matter of lowering it down in a way that people in the community can adapt to and will adapt to. But I do think it's really important from a safety perspective that we approach it from we should be designing safe systems overall, right? And anyone who wants to really dig into all the research and best practices that are available should read Neil Aronson, No Accident, right? So it's not driver's fault that accidents are happening. There's no accidents, they're collisions, right? And they're a combination of the drivers, the systems that are designed, the speed limits, the institutions that we have for driving and operating other kinds of vehicles in the city and moving around. That is what is resulting in all these collisions. And you can reduce it, and there's sort of proven best practices for doing that. Automated speed enforcement is one of them. And we know from a lot of the academic research on it that automated speed enforcement really makes a big difference in the number of collisions and the severity of the collisions, the number of injuries. So we can really reduce it, and I think through a combination of all these things, designing the roadways differently, having lower speed limits, having better enforcement of those speed limits, we can continue on the path we're on, which is to lower the number of injuries, make sure that the roads are safer for everyone who's using them. So I would support, I think based on what I'm hearing, maybe only 40 is what is going to be able to get through council at this point, but I think going to 30 in the community safety zones and school zones is appropriate. I think once we show how that can work and that it works better, expanding it to some of those residential streets, perhaps on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis where people say, you know, I want my neighborhood to be a community safety zone, and expand it. I know that I got neighborhoods in my ward where people would really like it to be 30 right now. They don't need to wait around. That's what they would like. So I support taking it down to 40. The sooner we can get to 30, the better, and I certainly will support 30 at council.
Just for committee, we are going to have to eventually move to either consensus, or we can always receive and file the report rather than spend the rest of the evening trying to persuade each other and then have this matter. This matter will come back up at council and will be debated fully. So I'm not trying to move anybody to a particular decision, but that's an option. That's an option for us. So Councillor Pelosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just having not spoken to this at all yet, thank you to staff for working on this and all the residents who took their time to give their feedback and those who joined us this evening in the gallery. And I would agree with the Community Association of Orchard Park that speeding is my #1 issue I'm hearing through my mailbox, requests for traffic calming. And very well, you know, everyone's upset about their neighborhood, but they probably cut through someone else's for shortcuts and on their way out. I have streets that are 80 and people complain about speeding, the 70, 60, 50, 40, it's everywhere. And honestly, I have them in my garage and I give them out at meetings, but I am tired of giving out respect the limit signs. It's that small moment of I've done something, but it's not working. And I know I send through to staff a lot of requests for traffic studies, for traffic calming, and then some residents say no, then it falls through, and there's still so many issues. So I certainly support 40. I'd support lower speed limits than that. Some councillors had brought the question, and some from the gallery, about enforcement. Having done my police ride along with a sergeant, we talked about enforcement, what they can do and the limited resources they have, and at what point they issue tickets, and it has to be for them so far over. So if ideally we'd want to see an easier enforcement for them, we'd lower the speed limits that they can give out higher tickets for the people going through. And I do believe that when you protect your most vulnerable people, you're protecting everyone. A lot of our streets don't have cycling infrastructure, even the painted line. A lot of our streets don't have it. So I do believe this also feeds into the climate emergency that the city declared, that when the streets are safer, people are gonna be more apt to walk, cycle, and use active transportation to get to them. I hear from some residents that you're gonna cost me all this more time, but for me, the idea behind it is you leave your local street, get onto the collector, and you know it's gonna be a slower go, winding your way through neighborhoods surrounding you, that you're just gonna go out to that arterial road as soon as possible. And that's what we wanna see. Like, you are the traffic in those neighborhoods, and it needs to, we're never gonna stop it, I recognize that, but we definitely need to reduce it. I see it in the mornings. I got 3 kids. I'm staying on the corner watching people try and find that new shortcut to save 2 minutes. I'm not sure how we've managed to get so much busier as a society that we forgot to care about our neighbors and those around us. So I will be supporting this motion this evening.
Anything? Councillor Lewis, you wanted to bring some wisdom to the conversation. I'm counting on you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm not sure how much wisdom I have left. I'm starting to look forward to dinner break, but I know you'll want to finish the agenda before we get there. So I will try to be brief, and I really want to say thank you, Deputy Mayor Helmer, for your comments. I don't think you and I are really that far apart on what we'd like to see as the long-term goals here, but and I will preface this, colleagues, by saying I never like to do this, but first, Mr. Chair, through you to staff, do we have a timeline on when we could expect the LTC's input back? Because I feel like we're missing a very important piece of information from an organization that's already approved a budget with a 15% increase for us in the multi-year budget in terms of what the speed limit change would mean, not just for the rapid transit corridors, which I've heard the response from our city engineer from, and I appreciate that. But I know that on collector streets out in our neighborhoods, particularly when there are not passengers waiting to embark or disembark from the bus, that the buses may get up to higher speeds. So I'm wondering when we could expect to hear back from LTC on what this impact may mean to them.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we had reached out to LTC some time ago. We did receive information back today that they're continuing to work on this. I think with the budget requests and other things, they've been quite busy. So I don't have a specific timeline from LTC. I don't imagine it's lengthy, however.
Okay, then I'm glad to hear it's not lengthy. I think what I would like to do at this point, and again, I preface this, I wish I wasn't having to do this, but I think I would like to put a motion on the floor to refer this back to staff to bring this report back to us with LTC's input on its possible impacts for consideration at a future committee meeting.
I make no promises and no predictions, but I can tell you that the assumption for bus rapid transit at the vehicles move on average 25 kilometers an hour. So that's the assumption in the business case. The general operating speed for buses is not that good because they don't run in dedicated lanes. So, I mean, it obviously varies according to the day and the route. A lot of the buses run on arterials, which are not affected by this. So Oxford Street, I mean, you're gonna have buses running the same speed they're running now. And I would imagine there'd be some minor impact, but nothing substantial.
Is there a seconder for the referral? Seconded by Councillor Lehman. Any discussion on the referral? I just wanted to speak very briefly, and I don't think anybody will be surprised by what I say, but, you know, having been in the business that I have been in as a lawyer for so many years, when someone says to me, with all due respect, there's a study here that says this, or there's a study here that says that, or there's a book that says this, I have to read it, I have to look at it, and particularly, I have to look at the supporting evidence from that report. So I'm very strict about that because of the number of times I've seen reports. And I just caution people, when you're looking at evidence in a report to say people were traveling at a certain speed when there was an accident, you have to find out where that evidence came from. And one of the things we heard today is, well, the London police evidence comes from witness reports. So the witnesses say, here's the speed the car was traveling at. Now think about that. You've got two interested parties who are in an accident. One may be a cyclist who's really mad at the driver of the vehicle, and the other person's a vehicle driver who may want to minimize the speed he was traveling at. So I know they don't do accident reconstruction. So all I'm saying is I'm really, really careful when people say there's evidence and you've got to look at it and it's you know, categorical. And so that's where I am right now. On the referral, I'll support it, but I'm not sure it's we're gonna end up having this discussion at council. And you know, whenever we have that, we'll have it. But I've learned a lot today from what I've heard from both sides of of the position. So I've got a lot more thinking to do, but I will support a referral because, quite frankly, having been on LTC, one of the most common statements that I hear from the LTC is nobody asked our input before they did this. Nobody asked our input before they did this. So although their input may be, that it's not a problem, I really would like to get that. So I'll support the referral.
To you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
So I cited a number of reports. I'm hyper conscious of the closed meeting rules, and so I'm trying to figure out a way to distribute those to all the members of the committee and council in such a way that they can consume them and look through all the references in there. Would it be appropriate to provide those to the committee secretary for distribution to the council?
I appreciate that, and I would love to receive those reports because they obviously got my attention when you set them out. Thank you. So we have a motion for referral. Anything further on that? Okay, we'll call the vote. It's pretty clear what the referral is for, just to get input from the LTC. Councillor Pelosi.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-1.
That was very anticlimactic, I know, but you know what we're doing. We're referring it to get input from LTC. But that could change at council, so stay tuned. Thank you very much again, everyone, for coming and providing information, particularly the councillors who are on the committee. Very helpful information, very much appreciated. Thank you. The next matter is an item for direction, which is parking changes from Councillor Lewis. I don't know if you have anything you want to say in support of that. I understand you've taken that through staff, and I don't think staff has an issue with looking at this issue.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Staff would work with our colleagues in bylaw enforcement. A lot of the work would actually come from that area and report back.
And I guess and if I could just say, I would be really, from my point of view, I would be very much interested in snow removal, how it affects snow removal. And the other issue, if it's all right, is differentiation between different neighborhoods and whether that would continue. I know that was mentioned.
Certainly snow removal is one of the peak reasons for the parking restrictions, Mr. Chair. With respect to different neighborhoods, I believe there's an intent to exclude some of the near campus neighborhoods and those sorts of issues that have particular parking challenges that need to be addressed specifically.
All right, thank you. Does that help, Councillor Lewis, or do you want to? All right, really?
I promise I'll be brief, Mr. Chair. As I indicated before, I am looking forward to making that dinner break happen. So, this is being brought forward. This is something I heard on the campaign trail. It's something that I continue to hear from residents. And I will tell you that since this came to public light last week, there's been incredibly positive reaction from residents looking to see the overnight parking ban period in particular compressed down so that we're only restricting from November through to the end of April. I had the pleasure of speaking with former Councillor Zafman, who raised this issue in the last council and was actually able to share a report with me on snow events and plow deployment that was done in the last council. So that really helped inform the time period I was speaking about here. This is about providing staff an opportunity to come back with us with a report on some ideas I think will offer some flexibility to residents in terms of their parking needs in their neighborhoods. Certainly, Mr. Chair, I recognize that you have a particular challenge with near campus neighborhood streets in your ward. And I respect that, and I think that it's important for everybody to know that even if we make changes to the city-wide policies, that it would of course be except where otherwise posted, where neighborhoods have opted to have a more restrictive parking regime than the broad citywide policy. I just think that when we look at the reality of folks today with the multi-generational families, with people who have to work 12-hour shifts, people coming and going at different times of the day and night through their households, and the fact that I feel pretty confident in saying when the staff do report back, we won't have any snow events in September or in May, that this is something that we can do reasonably well. I know in the last council there was a concern about some revenue losses if we shrink the period, but in conversations with staff, one of the great ideas I thought that was suggested was that perhaps we could offer additional passes for those people who need them at a fee, and that might recoup actually some of that revenue loss. Certainly not all of it, but it would also give us a data point on how many people need more than 15 uses. So I think that these are all options, and I'll say, Mr. Chair, that I'm not even sold necessarily on all of these options being good options, but these are options that people ask me to bring forward, and I want to hear back from staff on what the impacts and recommendations they have would be on implementing these if council chose to do so. So I know that they will do some good work. I know that they've got some data together already on this, and I look forward to the report coming back when it's ready.
And that's brief. That's Councillor Lewis brief. So I just want everybody to keep that in mind. You can retort.
Just
yeah.
a point of, I just didn't want to have to ask for a time extension, so I wanted to make sure I kept it under 5 minutes.
Sure. Councillor Lehman, you're going to second this?
I'll second this. I think this is good that we look at this. I mean, it recognizes when we actually have snow removal in the city. The only thing I'm not too sold on is parallel parking on the driveway. So I would like staff to look at a couple things. One is, do they see that as causing a blind spot for people pulling out, neighbors pulling out? And also, do they see a potential for damage to city property on the boulevards in getting their cars in and out of that area, especially in the springtime and the wintertime? That's one I'm a little iffy, but I will second Councillor Lewis's motion.
Just to remember, we're not arguing just to be clear, I don't know if I'll be supportive of this, but I'm all right with a referral. So Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When it does come time to vote, I want D separated out, as I'd like to vote no on D. I'm concerned about the sight lines on some corners if people are parking at the end of their driveways. Some driveways are wider than others, and now cars are double wide, and it kind of looks like a lane of traffic almost. You start getting wider driveways. Also concerned about the cyclists. If the doors are there, a lot of people are just thinking, I'm parked in my driveway getting out, and they're not thinking about dooring the cyclists that are going by. Some of those areas aren't always lit at the end of your driveway. It's very far from your porch light, and there's not always street lights on every street, so I would like that one separate to vote on separate.
Okay, so just to be clear, this is not a decision, it's just referring, so you don't even want people to think about it. Okay, that's fine. I just want to be clear, because often what council does is debates the end result when they're doing a referral. It's one of these things I've seen. So we'll separate it out, and you can vote against it. Anything else before we bring it forward? All right, so we'll bring forward everything except D, is it?
Yes, please.
Okay, we'll bring forward everything except D. That's excluding D, yep. Okay, voting. Mine's not working. It's not doing its thing. Oh yeah, I forgot that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
And now we'll pull D. or we'll vote on D.
Closing the vote, the motion fails 2-2.
And moving on to the deferred matters list. I think there's one matter to be removed. If you could just provide me with a number, we'll move that. I didn't make a note of it, my apologies.
Remember? He knows.
Thank you. Through the chair, number 5/94, report on private works impacting the transportation network. That was reported back and a resolution flowed.
Can we just someone move removal of that from the deferred matters list? Moved by Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Lehman. Anything? We'll vote. Then we have to approve the rest of the deferred matters list.
See what Jerry puts up there.
She didn't pull one. Do I need to say or will it just be pulled? She'll pull it. I've been told that it will be taken off the list, even though we're just doing one motion.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
All right, I need a motion to, what we're going to do now is we'll go in camera and then we have one public matter. My intention would be, unless the committee has an issue with that, is to do that public matter when we're finished in the committee room, unless someone wants to come back. But I need a motion to go in camera for the reasons set out on the agenda. Moved by Councillor Pelosi, seconded by Councillor Lehman. Any discussion? We'll vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.